Harold Shipman was the doctor you trusted with your life, but what if behind that calm exterior was a man who secretly decided when your life would end? For decades, Shipman, revered by his patients and colleagues, was quietly killing those in his care. But how did he do it without raising suspicion? And what led to his eventual capture? Dive into the shocking case of the world's deadliest doctor, whose betrayal shattered the bond between doctor and patient forever. Harold Frederick Shipman, born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, appeared to lead an unremarkable early life. Raised in a working-class family, Shipman was particularly close to his mother, Vera. Vera Shipman was a dominant figure in Harold's life, instilling in him a sense of superiority and entitlement. Harold often believed himself to be smarter and more capable than those around him, an attitude that would follow him into adulthood. His mother's death from lung cancer in 1963, when Harold was just 17, profoundly impacted him. Vera's final days were marked by the administration of morphine to ease her pain, and young Harold was captivated by how the drug provided comfort. It was during this time that Shipman witnessed the power doctors wield over life and death. This event would leave an indelible mark on his psyche, though no one could have predicted that this fascination would one day lead to hundreds of deaths. Shipman went on to attend medical school at Leeds School of Medicine, graduating in 1970. By all appearances, he was on track to become a respected physician, working first at Pontefract General Infirmary in West Yorkshire. But soon, his darker impulses would surface. In 1974, Shipman took up a general practitioner position in Todmorden, West Yorkshire. It was here that the first signs of his criminal behavior began to show. Shipman developed an addiction to pethidine, a synthetic opioid used to relieve pain. To feed his addiction, Shipman started forging prescriptions to obtain the drug illegally. This was not a one-time error in judgment, but a pattern of behavior that spiraled into forgery and deceit. In 1975, his colleagues noticed discrepancies in his prescription records, prompting an investigation. He was eventually caught forging pethidine prescriptions for his own use. Despite his arrest and conviction, Shipman faced remarkably few consequences. He was fined and briefly attended a rehabilitation program. Astonishingly, his medical career continued uninterrupted. Instead of losing his license, Shipman relocated, leaving his forgery scandal behind him and resuming his practice as a general practitioner. This incident marks a pivotal point in Shipman's life. Though he had been caught forging drugs, the leniency with which he was treated emboldened him. Shipman realized that the system had blind spots he could exploit, and it was from this point that his murderous tendencies truly began to take shape. After the incident with the forged pethidine prescriptions and his subsequent rehabilitation, Harold Shipman relocated to Hyde, Greater Manchester, where he would begin his reign of terror. In 1977, Shipman joined a medical practice in the area before eventually opening his own clinic in 1992. It was here, in this small, close-knit town, that his killing spree began. Shipman carefully built a reputation as a compassionate and attentive doctor. He took special care with his elderly patients, many of whom saw him as a trusted figure in their final years. He cultivated strong relationships with his patients and their families, creating an image of reliability and devotion. What no one realized was that behind the caring doctor's exterior lurked a man intent on controlling life and death itself. His modus operandi was deceptively simple and incredibly effective. Shipman would inject his patients with a lethal dose of diamorphine, a powerful opioid better known as heroin. Morphine was commonly used in medical practices, especially for patients suffering from severe pain or in palliative care. But Shipman wasn't using it to ease pain. He was using it to kill. Shipman specifically targeted elderly patients, typically women, who would often die suddenly and without warning after a routine visit from their doctor. His preference for elderly victims served him well. Deaths among older people are often less scrutinized, especially if there are no obvious signs of foul play. He became adept at concealing his crimes within the normal expectations of his profession. When one of his patients died, he would fill out the death certificate himself, often attributing the cause to heart attacks or old age. No one questioned his authority. Why would they? Shipman was their doctor, a man trusted implicitly by the community. Shipman would often visit his victims at home, creating a personal connection with them and appearing to provide attentive care. In some cases, after administering the fatal dose of diamorphine, he would stay with the patient until they died, manipulating the situation to make it appear as though he was simply doing his job. His patients trusted him completely, unaware that he was their executioner. By the time the family was informed of the death, Shipman had already covered his tracks, making sure that no suspicion was raised. In some cases, Shipman would even encourage the victims' families to cremate the body, which destroyed any evidence that could have indicated a lethal dose of diamorphine. The cremation prevented any autopsy or further investigation, thus erasing the trail of his heinous acts. This strategy of operating in plain sight, combined with his meticulous attention to detail in falsifying medical records, allowed Shipman to evade detection for over 2 decades. He knew the system intimately, and he exploited it at every turn. What made Harold Shipman such a terrifyingly effective killer was not just his medical knowledge, but his ability to manipulate the system with chilling precision. He knew that as a doctor, his word would rarely be questioned, and he took full advantage of this trust. But it wasn't only his patients who were deceived, so too were his colleagues, the medical establishment, and the legal system. Shipman developed a cold, methodical approach to murder. After selecting his victim, usually someone vulnerable and elderly, he would adjust their medical records posthumously. He did this to ensure that their deaths seemed consistent with their supposed medical history. By retroactively altering their files, he made it appear that they had been suffering from serious illnesses or were in decline, even if the patient had been in relatively good health just days before. This manipulation made it difficult for anyone to question the validity of the cause of death he listed on their death certificate. The sheer scale of Shipman's deception is staggering. He meticulously documented fake symptoms in patient records to justify the diamorphine overdose. For instance, he might note that a patient had been suffering from increasing pain or respiratory issues, even when no such problems had been reported by the patient themselves. Once the patient was dead, he would often attribute their death to a heart attack or other natural causes that wouldn't raise suspicions. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, the patient had already been cremated, and the truth had literally gone up in smoke. In some cases, Shipman's confidence in his own invulnerability was evident. On more than one occasion, he administered a fatal dose of diamorphine while in the presence of another person, later assuring them that the patient had simply died of natural causes. Shipman's demeanor was calm, and his reassurances were convincing. People trusted him because, after all, he was their doctor. No one suspected that the man they looked to for care and guidance was the very person responsible for their loved one's death. One of the most sinister aspects of Shipman's killings was his manipulation of grieving families. After the death of a patient, Shipman often presented himself as the caring, compassionate doctor, offering condolences and reassuring family members that the death had been peaceful and expected. In several cases, he advised families to avoid post-mortems, convincing them that autopsies would only prolong their grief. This advice was not driven by concern for the family, but by his need to cover his tracks. Without a post-mortem, no one could discover the lethal dose of diamorphine that had killed the patient. In addition to killing for control, Shipman may have also had financial motivations. Some of his victims had large estates, and while his primary motivation appeared to be exerting power over life and death, he did benefit financially in a few cases. For instance, in the case of Kathleen Grundy, Shipman forged a will that left him almost $400,000 of her estate. This act of forgery would eventually lead to his downfall, But it also illustrated how Shipman's greed sometimes influenced his choice of victims. For over 2 decades, Harold Shipman killed with impunity. His methodical approach, combined with his status as a doctor, allowed him to evade suspicion. He carefully manipulated medical records, falsified death certificates, and preyed on the inherent trust people placed in their doctors. His victims, many of whom were elderly, had no idea that the man they trusted most was the very one deciding when their lives would end. It wasn't until 1998, after the death of Kathleen Grundy and the suspicious will, that Shipman's pattern of deception began to unravel. Once investigators looked deeper into his past, the extent of his crimes became clear. Dozens of bodies were exhumed, and toxicology reports confirmed what no one had dared to suspect. Harold Shipman was Britain's most prolific serial killer, responsible for over 200 deaths. Shipman's case shook the very foundations of trust between patients and doctors, leaving an indelible scar on the medical community and serving as a stark reminder that even those entrusted with the greatest care can betray that trust in the darkest of ways. The case of Kathleen Grundy, the slip that led to his downfall. Harold Shipman might have continued killing for many more years if not for one crucial mistake: the murder of Kathleen Grundy. Kathleen, an 81-year-old former mayor of Hyde, was well known and respected in the local community. She was in excellent health for her age and was involved in various social activities. On June 24, 1998, Kathleen Grundy was found dead at her home, just hours after Shipman had visited her for a routine checkup. Shipman recorded the cause of death as old age, but her daughter, Angela Woodruff, a lawyer, immediately suspected something was wrong. Not only had her mother been in good health, but a will had also surfaced shortly after her death, leaving the entirety of Kathleen's estate, worth nearly $400,000, to Harold Shipman. The will, allegedly drafted by Kathleen D., was crudely written and full of errors, raising red flags for Woodruff. Angela Woodruff took her concerns to the police, setting off a full-scale investigation. Her mother's body was exhumed, and toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in her system. This was the damning evidence that linked Shipman directly to her murder. Investigators also discovered that the will had been forged by Shipman, further implicating him in a plot to steal from his victim. Harold Shipman's killing spree might have gone on for even longer, if not for a combination of arrogance and a series of small but crucial suspicions. It was the death of Kathleen Grundy, an 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde, that would ultimately expose his web of deceit and murder. In June 1998, Kathleen Grundy, a well-known and respected figure in Hyde, was found dead in her home just hours after a routine visit from Dr. Shipman. Her death was sudden, but not entirely unexpected given her age. Shipman, who had been her doctor for years, attributed her death to natural causes and filled out the death certificate without raising any red flags. This should have been the end of it, but Shipman made a critical mistake that would unravel his entire scheme. After Kathleen's death, her daughter Angela Woodruff, a solicitor, was surprised to learn of a new will that had allegedly been drawn up by her mother. The will, which surfaced after Kathleen's passing, left the entirety of her substantial estate, worth nearly $400,000, to none other than Dr. Harold Shipman. Even more shocking was the fact that Angela, along with her mother's grandchildren, had been completely written out of the will. Angela, knowing her mother well, found this highly suspicious. She also knew that her mother had always been meticulous about her legal affairs, and such a drastic change in the will seemed out of character. Angela took the will to a handwriting expert, who confirmed her suspicions. It had been forged. With this evidence in hand, she reported the matter to the police, setting off a chain of events that would eventually expose Shipman for what he truly was. Initially, the police investigation was centered on the forgery of the will, but it soon became apparent that Kathleen Grundy's death itself was suspicious. If Shipman had gone so far as to falsify her will, What else might he have been hiding? Detectives decided to dig deeper into the circumstances of her death. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed in August 1998, and toxicology tests revealed a shocking discovery. She had been injected with a lethal dose of diamorphine, the very same drug Shipman had been prescribing to many of his elderly patients. This finding was enough to prompt a full-scale investigation into Shipman's past. The police, led by Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles, began to suspect that Kathleen Grundy might not be Shipman's only victim. Authorities started combing through the records of Shipman's former patients, particularly those who had died under his care in recent years. They found a disturbing pattern. An unusually high number of his patients had died suddenly, often following a home visit from Shipman. In many cases, he had been the one to issue the death certificate, and the causes of death he listed were often vague or attributed to natural causes. There was no clear reason for anyone to suspect foul play at the time, but now, with the new evidence, these deaths seemed suspicious. The police expanded their investigation, exhuming more bodies of Shipman's former patients. Each exhumation brought more horrifying results. Time after time, toxicology tests revealed that the victims had died from lethal doses of diamorphine. Shipman had carefully targeted elderly victims whose deaths were unlikely to raise alarm, but his arrogance in forging the will of Kathleen Grundy had brought his secret to light. As the investigation progressed, the scale of Shipman's killing spree became increasingly clear. By the end of the inquiry, it was estimated that Shipman had murdered at least 215 of his patients, though the actual number could be even higher. The majority of his victims were women over the age of 70, but Shipman didn't exclusively target the elderly. His youngest known victim was a 41-year-old man. Shipman had operated with impunity for over 2 decades, using his position as a doctor to administer lethal doses of diamorphine under the guise of medical treatment. His knowledge of the medical system allowed him to manipulate records, falsify death certificates, and present himself as a caring physician who was simply helping his patients pass peacefully. In reality, he was methodically murdering them, often for no other reason than his desire to control life and death. Investigators discovered that Shipman had used a variety of tactics to cover his tracks. In some cases, he had altered patient records to make it appear as though the victim had been suffering from serious medical conditions. This made their sudden death seem more plausible and less likely to be questioned. He had also taken advantage of his authority as a doctor to convince grieving families to cremate their loved ones, thus destroying any potential evidence. As more and more victims were identified, it became clear that Shipman had been operating without fear of detection. His patients trusted him implicitly, and the medical community had no reason to suspect that a doctor, someone sworn to save lives, could be responsible for such heinous acts. On September 7, 1998, Harold Shipman was finally arrested at his home in Hyde. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Dozens of bodies had been exhumed, all showing signs of diamorphine poisoning, and the forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will provided a clear motive in at least one case. The trial, which began in October 1999 at Preston Crown Court, was one of the most sensational in British legal history. Shipman was charged with 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery related to the will of Kathleen Grundy. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the toxicology reports from the exhumed bodies, witness testimonies from the families of the victims, and the forged will. Throughout the trial, Shipman showed little remorse or emotion. He maintained his innocence, claiming that the patients had died of natural causes and that he had done nothing wrong. His defense team argued that the high rate of deaths among his patients was simply a coincidence, but the jury was unconvinced. The evidence was too damning and the pattern of deception too clear. On January 31, 2000, Harold Shipman was found guilty of 15 murders and the forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending that he never be released. The conviction was a relief for the families of his victims, but it was also bittersweet. Shipman had taken the lives of their loved ones, and no amount of justice could bring them back. Even after his conviction, investigations into Shipman's crimes continued. A government inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, was launched to determine the full extent of his killing spree. The inquiry concluded that Shipman had likely killed over 200 people during his career as a doctor, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. The inquiry also exposed serious flaws in the oversight of medical professionals in the UK. Shipman had been able to exploit the trust placed in doctors and operate with little scrutiny for over 2 decades. As a result of the inquiry, changes were made to the way deaths are reported and how controlled substances like diamorphine are monitored in medical practices. Despite his conviction and the subsequent investigations, Harold Shipman continued to maintain his innocence. He never confessed to the murders, and in January 2004, he took his own life in his prison cell, hanging himself with bedsheets. His death denied the families of his victims any sense of closure, leaving many unanswered questions about his motives and the true extent of his crimes. The case of Harold Shipman sent shockwaves through the medical community and the public at large. It shattered the trust between doctors and patients, raising questions about how someone in such a position of authority could abuse their power so horrifically. The case led to significant reforms in the medical profession, but the scars left by Shipman's actions will never fully heal. For the families of his victims, Shipman's death was a hollow ending to a nightmare that had spanned decades. The man they had once trusted with their loved ones' lives had betrayed them in the worst possible way, and the true extent of his evil may never be fully known. Uber's aftermath, a broken system and Shipman's death. Harold Shipman's crimes sent shockwaves through the UK and the medical community. His case raised serious questions about how a doctor could have gotten away with such a high number of murders for so long without detection. In response, the General Medical Council, GMC, introduced tighter regulations, particularly concerning the certification of death and the monitoring of prescriptions for controlled substances. But even after his conviction, Shipman continued to exert control over his own fate. On January 13th, 2004, just a day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found dead in his prison cell at HM Prison Wakefield. He had hanged himself with bedsheets, leaving behind no note or explanation. His death denied the families of his victims the chance to hear him admit his guilt or express remorse. Though Harold Shipman is gone, the legacy of his crimes endures. His case stands as a chilling reminder that those we trust the most can sometimes harbor the darkest secrets. For the families of his victims, the pain and betrayal caused by the Doctor of Death will never fully fade.